Thank you again for inviting me, and I am really delighted to be able to talk about Harry White because I have always wanted to know more about him, and it's really interesting to find a group of people who are interested in him. And I can tell you what I know, and I think you've also talked to Jeff Meek,
Yeah.
Who's done a lot of the kind of research I think that really needed to be done into his life. But how I found out about him goes like this, basically. I met an important Russian researcher of the Stalin period who was visiting Toronto at the time. I was at the University of Toronto. And he and I had a conversation where I just wanted to know, look, in the archive of Stalin's papers and so on, what do you know about, what have you seen that might have anything to do with the recriminalization of homosexuality in 1933-34? And he told me, this is already 1994, that the previous year, the Russian periodical that publishes documents from what's now known as the Presidential Archive of the Russian Federation, had published this document. And in fact, he didn't refer to the Harry White document. He referred to correspondence between Stalin and the secret police that initiated the recriminalization of homosexuality. The archive it's come from is actually the former archive of the General Secretary of the Communist Party. So it's the holiest of holies. It's, you know, the safe at the back of Stalin's office, the safe at the back of Mikhail Gorbachev's office. And it is, I mean, it's bigger than a safe, obviously, but it is, the documents were considered, I guess you could say, the most radioactive. And what delights me about that is that the two things that were in that one issue of the journal, the official sort of correspondence between Stalin and the OGPU about criminalizing homosexuality, and this piece of humor, both come from the same file. So there's a file in this holiest of holies, in this archive, with, if you observe the page numbers that have been cited in both articles, you see that, there's about 20 pages between them. There's more material in there. And one day someone will get access to it and look at it. I hope it's a young Russian researcher in LGBT studies who gets that chance one day. But those were published documents already in 1993. But nobody had really tried to understand them. And so my work was an attempt to understand them and find context for them, try to understand where they came from. As far as I'm concerned, yes, they are genuine. The journal it was published in is very serious. And it's, you know, we have no reason to believe that this is a fabrication. I noticed in the conversation, the part that you sent me, that you had asked Zhenya whether it was a kind of artist's fabrication to imagine a mindset, imagine an imaginary world. And I know that goes on a lot in the art world, and particularly in LGBTQ art from this region. It's a very interesting aspect of LGBTQ art in the former Soviet republics. But in this case, it really did cross Stalin's desk. Stalin did annotate it. in possibly weeks or days before Stalin's reading this letter, he's actually looking at the text of the new law against sodomy, and he's editing it. And we know that he changes the text fairly significantly. He gets a kind of template serving suggestion from the OGPU, from the secret police, in 1933, late 1933 or early 1934. And he looks at that, and there are some things in it that he doesn't like very much. So we see Stalin's blue pencil, and the secret police had proposed that not just ordinary sodomy should be a crime, but that sodomy performed in public or for pay. In other words, public manifestations of sexual activity between men and male prostitution should get higher penalties. So there's a second line in the law that the OGPU proposes that mentions public sex and sex for pay. And Stalin underlines the word public, publichna, and is clearly surprised by that. And then he strikes out the entire phrase because it's a little bit too graphic for him. And it probably shows the Soviet Union in a very poor light. If people are selling their asses on the street, as it were. So that's how I imagine him thinking of it. So there's that. And there's also another point where he edits the law, and that is around the sentences, the minimum sentence for sodomy. And he makes it clear in the law that the minimum sentence should be not less than 3 years in corrective labor camp. And the importance of that is that a sentence under 3 years, which would have been possible in the draft that the OGPU sent him, would mean that you could go to, you could end up in a local penal colony that was closer to home and that had potentially a sort of lighter work regime. What he was doing by saying minimum 3 years was banishing you to the outer edges of the Gulag, to the far north, to the far east, to the big construction projects, to the places where you would be chopping down wood and dying of emaciation. So it was a very significant edit he did when he changed the sentencing parameters for sodomy in 1934. So those are two examples, I think, of Stalin's mind looking at this problem that we can get.
Could I ask two questions?
Sure.
Firstly, just my mind runs apace. Do you think this relates to his own upbringing in seminaries, A? And B, I mean, why was this an issue? Why was he bothering to do it in 1933?
Now, as far as Stalin's personal relationship with homosexuality, we can be sure he's probably heard about it from his stays in prison and his exile, and from his association with same-sex institutions like the seminary, and then later on army and secret police. It will not have been news to him in 1933 that such a thing existed at all. And it was very, very commonplace in boarding schools like the one he went to, the seminary in Tbilisi, that male same-sex relations took place, coerced and voluntary in those kinds of settings. So what we can't do is put Stalin, in the bed with another boy and say that happened. We don't have that documentation.
But in the institutions you mentioned, such as the army, the seminary, and the same-sex institutions, it's possible that the homosexual act was associated with rape.
Yes, that's exactly it. And so we're not talking, see, this is where we get into trouble, I think, because you can talk about the homosexual act, but then if it's rape, how much are we talking about homosexuals? How much are we talking about heterosexuals, bisexuals, people who are on some kind of spectrum or not? Which is why I'm cautious about saying that Stalin had a particular view about homosexuals as such. That's what's so interesting about Harry White's letter. He asserts a homosexual identity for the sort of inborn homosexual, not the sort of acquired homosexuality, but the homosexual not through choice but by birth, as it were. And that's what's really interesting in his letter. So I think that's a partial answer. Now, why is Stalin doing it at this point?
Yeah.
First of all, the initiative doesn't come from Stalin's desk, but from the secret police. And that we still don't have a straight answer on this one, but there are a couple of plausible reasons. And I talk about these in both books, the old book and the new book. And the new book brings us up to date a little bit on what is knowable. What I think is probably going on is that in 1933, the secret police have to issue ID documents to every city dweller in the Soviet Union. And they start with the biggest cities, Leningrad, Moscow, Kiev. And they give everybody a passport. And during the passportization process, what they end up learning about the population is quite rich. And they never let a good piece of compromat go to waste. They keep it on file. And I think what happens in 1933, 32, 33, as passportization is being rolled out, is that they begin to notice clusters of friends and friends of friends of groups of male homosexuals, and they begin to think about the political problem that poses in an increasingly paranoid state.
So what do they think of as the political problem? That they're all going to not vote for Stalin?
Well, they're all going to vote for Stalin because there isn't anyone else to vote for, first of all. But the problem is really conspiratorial groups of men gathering outside of the party's sort of organization and gaze, and cutting across all kinds of occupational and class and responsibility lines. So you have, cooks associating with high party elite members, associating with tram drivers, associating with the guy who takes your ticket at the Bolshoi Theater, and so on and so on. And it's not a very the secret police do not feel secure about that.
But in what way could it be politically subversive?
Well, we might not see that as politically subversive, but I think that the secret police thought differently, certainly back then. First of all, what we have going on, just to step back a bit, is a major crisis in urban Russia during the early 1930s. And it's been caused by collectivization and dekulakization. So there's this mass movement of about 10 million peasants into the cities to escape collectivization in the first 2 or 3 years of the 1930s. So that's a huge movement of people into the cities. The cities can't cope. There hasn't been enough building. There hasn't been enough food and infrastructure provided. And so the cities are crammed to the gills. And there are a lot of people who shouldn't be in the cities. And the government's response is passportization. And they're going to filter everybody in the city and decide who should stay and who should go. so that's the backdrop, if you like. There's a big crisis going on, and this is the sort of persecution of homosexuals is a kind of sideshow, kind of small beer compared to the bigger crisis that's going on. And of course, we have a famine in the countryside in 1932-33 caused by collectivization, and 5 to 7 million people starved to death in the Soviet countryside. City workers are fed. And this is another reason why passportization is so important. Filtering the population in the city is so important, because they are taking food literally out of the mouths of peasants. And it has to be for a reason, right? So the 5-year plan is the reason, productivity is the reason, and no one should be in the socialist city who doesn't deserve to be there.
Just think, if it had really caught on, homosexuality, if all of those people coming from the countryside in their millions had been coerced or drifted toward this other Freemasonry of the homosexual, and then hey.
Yeah. No, I think Matthew's underlined an interesting point, and that is the Bolsheviks' relationship to pleasure. My view is that the Bolsheviks really did not trust pleasure. They did not see it as a liberating revolutionary force. Alexandra Kollontai was anomalous. She talks about pleasure in her writing, very compelling novels, for example, and essays about women's access to pleasure as part of sexuality, and the transformative nature of that pleasure, the transformative importance of that pleasure for liberating women's psychology. Those are very powerful ideas, and that's why she gets shut down and is not really allowed to publicize them very much after about 1923. So there is a kind of disengagement with that liberation agenda of the early 1920s by this time. And it comes out of the Stalinization of the health ministry as part of it, and also the kind of the shift in priorities away from utopian forms of liberation to very practical, pragmatic, hard-nosed goals around militarization, industrialization, and 5-year plan investment.
I still don't understand why homophobia is an absolute vital component in that. I don't understand why that would be.
Well, homophobia is part of...
Harry didn't understand either. Maybe no. Harry also didn't understand.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Harry didn't get it. And he was being, I think, a very good Marxist in the way that he analyzed the problem. I'm not sure I agree with it on all accounts, but he offers a really very strong argument for retaining the existing situation and not implementing this law. But again, we have to go back, I think, to the mindset of the early 20th century when governments across the political spectrum, from liberal democracy to fascism, Nazism to communism, all thought they could control human populations at quite an intimate level. Is what Michel Foucault calls biopower. So actually trying to enhance, to grow populations and to make them healthier and to make them more capable as workers and as soldiers and as mothers. Everybody had their role to play, but the idea was that humanity was somehow malleable and perfectible, and that science actually offered ways to do that. And so as part of that, getting rid of sexual anomalies made sense to a certain kind of mindset.
седлай коней, в Москву скакать. Ради русского царства великого.
Come back to Harry White. What do you think he thought he was doing?
He thought, I think he really genuinely did think there was a debate to be had, and that there were serious points to be made about this. I mean, he obviously had, quite a clear line worked out on how Marxism and some kind of anti-homophobic politics meshed together, how it worked. And I don't think he's alone in that. There's a genuine sense among thoughtful gay men in Soviet Russia that they are very much part of the sexual revolution, and that they understand the decriminalization of sodomy in 1922 as part of their birthright of their piece of the sexual revolution, if you like. Whether they all have the same sophisticated Marxist analysis that Harry develops for himself is another matter, but they certainly see the Russian Revolution as a revolution for them as well.
I'm also getting a kind of going back to the Bolshevik relationship to pleasure. I'm getting something about the difference between adrenalines and endorphins, and that paranoia gives you a lot of adrenaline, and also tearing things down, taking risks and so on. I mean, those bring adrenalines, and whereas the sexuality is more endorphinous, and I think that Harry White's statements in the letter also are lighter. They're more endorphinous in the sense that when he says the fact of who he is doesn't restrict him from being a revolutionary. I mean, it's a more of a kind of, it's more on the endorphinous side. And I'm making a big jump then to say something about a kind of Edinburgh-based, being a good Marxist could also be being a good logical-minded Edinburgh man.
In terms of Harry White and whether or not he's a typical Edinburgh man, I think he was much more loyal to Moscow than to Edinburgh, given that conscious choice at any moment in his life.
He's certainly very committed to Moscow, isn't he? I mean, he's made an application, according to this letter, he's made an application to have his party membership transferred from the British Communist Party to the Soviet Communist Party, which is, a good Catholic priest going to Rome. I think it's the big commitment, and he obviously is struggling to remain in the Rome of the communist movement by trying to figure out how he's actually going to reconcile his homosexuality with his communism going forward. I mean, he's going around to different psychiatrists to find out, first of all, if they understand what the basis of homosexuality is and whether it's possible to cure homosexuality. I mean, he even, at least theoretically, contemplates whether he would undergo a cure if a pill were available, or if a Freudian session were available that could cure you. He talks about that possibility in the letter, which I went back to it today and read it again, and it's fascinating that he might renounce his homosexuality to maintain his faith, as it were, in communism. And he quite boldly says that he won't, and that I think is Matthew's endorphin moment.
No, absolutely.
I do think that in Angus's exhibition, and with its confrontation of painted works and made works, and then you have the documentary aspect and a different history, and there's a kind of you're moving between various different poles, and then you do see these statements, these graphic statements, and those statements are taken out of their context and placed, and that these are actually, if they're simply read for what they are, the sequence of 6 words, or like if they hang there, that they are uplifting.
I think there's a lot of adrenaline in it too. You don't address Stalin without a great deal of guts and a great deal of courage. This is about speaking truth to power, and putting yourself in a very vulnerable position. And so he was alerting the secret police of the fact that he was actually homosexual, and he was involved in a relationship with a Soviet citizen, a Russian man. And that is already putting yourself in danger. There's a lot of courage here that's really, really, really attractive, really admirable.
But Harry White isn't arrested and stays. This is for sure. He does not leave the Soviet Union until August 1936. So what happens in this 2 years from May 34 until August 36? What on earth is going on there? How can he survive?
I can't really fill this space except with speculation. What I do know, for example, is that there are inquiries within the party about homosexual activity on the part of party members who previously had been, their homosexual activity had been ignored. But now it was under scrutiny as part of this kind of general review of people's documents and people's membership in the party. One of the things that leads to the Great Terror of 1937-38 is a continual kind of churning of the party membership rolls from about 1934 to 1936, precisely your period that you're asking about. So every party member has to go before local commissions and justify themselves and blurt out their autobiography and say what they have done for the party and what their mistakes have been. Self-criticism. And it's a period of a kind of dark night of the soul for just about everybody in the party, particularly after the Kirov murder at the end of 1934. So the backdrop again is one that is growing in paranoia, growing in adrenaline versus endorphins, and growing in anti-erotic energy, I would say, as well. This is a gathering paranoia that is engulfing the party. And you can imagine Harry being in considerable anguish during this period.
So my question is, would you have been through one of these sort of purgatorial inquisitions, do you think, as a foreign correspondent?
Almost certainly. Everybody, as a communist, it would have been a ritual that every communist would have gone through.
Sorry, when you say that, do you mean women too?
Yes, women communists too. So these are members of the Communist Party, not the entire sort of population of the Soviet Union, but that small elite that was, the vanguard of the proletariat, and who were members who were expected to conform politically. So they were going through, there was the verification of party documents, and then there was the exchange of party documents. So this is all paper-based system, remember, with no computers. And so people are being asked to bring in their party card and show us that it's a genuine party card. And then there is the reissuing of party documents the following year. I think this is 1936, when people have to come in and justify their membership in the party. And the party uses these contact moments of contact, to quiz people in depth about their political opinions, about their family and other contacts. Do you have family abroad? Do you have family who fought for the whites in the Civil War? Do you have friends and associates who are known supporters of Trotsky, and so on and so on? So there's that kind of inquisitorial and purgatorial sort of exercise going on. I'm sure that Harry would have had to submit himself to something like that, and it's hard to imagine what he would have said after having written that letter. He wouldn't know where it had gone. He wouldn't know who had read it. He wouldn't even know if Stalin had read it.
I mean, from these discussions, I'm getting more of a feel of a kind of a demonization of a whole contingent of people who somehow can't be trusted, because they have an allegiance that's not clearly out there for communist principles, and that in Harry White's letter, because of the way he expresses himself, which I still feel has a trace of Edinburgh about it, his letter at length says, I can be trusted. We can be trusted. Mm-hmm. This is logic. This is good Marxism. This has a strong theoretical base, and so we are to be trusted.
The queer men who are being interrogated by the OGPU in 1933 in St. Peter, in Leningrad, are bewildered. They don't understand what the purpose of this law is. They say, "What? You're going to arrest all the queens who are hanging around by Catherine the Great statue? What's the point of that?" And they're quite remarkably bold, cheeky even, with the OGPU. It's 1933, it's not 1937 yet. And they don't contend or argue with them, but they do actually express their bewilderment. And in a sense, they're also expressing their understanding of the sexual revolution, which was, Tsar Revolution too. So there they are in the police cells, and they're saying that as well. So yes, I think that there is there's a wider world to the world that produced Harry White and his letter. And it was a Russian-speaking world. It wasn't just an Edinburgh-produced extraordinary individual who makes the journey from Britain to the Soviet Union to become part of the Soviet project. But it's actually something that's made in the USSR.
Just actually thought, because I was thinking about the contemporaneity of this Harry White situation with things like Foster's Maurice and class and things, but I can't remember, but I don't think that there's a working class voice speaking up in England, or Britain, in any way parallel to Harry White's from the point of view of his class. It's always the patricians and the Oxford-educated toffs who are seducing these lower class people who are writing the novels or speaking up, or, you know, claiming themselves in a lineage from Oscar Wilde.
Well, I think he deserves to be better known, because we now care much more about sexual politics from left-wing perspectives. And we are not very good, actually, at understanding the genealogy of these perspectives and where they come from. We think everything started in 1968. And at some level, that's my sort of mischievous interpretation, I would say. But there is a tendency to think that it started with that, and that earlier iterations were fragmented or backward or failed to take account of certain things. You know, we have these various ways of looking at feminism and at sexual politics of the 1920s and 30s that condescend to look upon them as less developed. And I think that one of the extraordinary things about Harry's letter is that here you have condensed in 4,000 words a fantastic argument for the liberation of homosexuals from a communist perspective that's fully worked out. It just adds a whole different dimension to our understanding of what gay people thought about the nature of sexual politics in this period. And it's certainly, because he made that very brave intervention directly to Stalin, it gives us a window into what Stalin thought that's really critical for understanding the nature of the socialist world's take on homosexuality in a kind of Stalin and post-Stalin form. Without Harry White's letter, we wouldn't know that in quite the same way. An idiot and a degenerate to the archives. There's a lot in that. A lot in that.